Hey there, Frederick Douglass Elementary School. It's Mrs. Shupard, and I'm here with another episode of Tucked In Tuesday. And we're continuing our book, our one book, one Seaford book, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. And today we're going to be reading chapter 8 and 9. Chapter 8, 20 Days. 2 weeks after I buried my dog, cholera swept through our district. Doctors said the sickness started in southern Malawi back in November. A farmer visiting a funeral brought it north where it spread like grass fire. Within days, hundreds of people were sick and 12 had died. Cholera is a highly contagious infection that causes severe diarrhea. People mostly get it by eating food or drinking water that has been contaminated with feces. Across Africa, it's an unfortunate companion of every rainy season. Many villages have poorly built latrines that flood with the rains and pollute the wells and streams where people drink. Blowflies also spread the bacteria after crawling out of toilets and landing on food. The diarrhea that results is clear and milky and quickly leads to dehydration. If people aren't treated immediately, they could die. During the famine, people out looking for food became the unwitting carriers. The cholera struck them on the roads and forced them to become sick in the bush. Rain, flies, and cockroaches then spread the infection onto the banana peels, roots, and corn husks that other people picked up to eat. To combat the cholera, the clinic at the trading center started giving away chlorine to clean our drinking water. For months, it tasted like metal, so they also advised families to cover the holes of the latrines to keep out the flies. My father had made a lid from a piece of iron sheeting, but as soon as it was removed, the flat green blowflies swarmed out like a biblical plague and smashed into your head and face. It was a lot of work trying to swat them and finish your business at the same time. In those days, any signs of diarrhea near the latrine hole caused alarm. Each morning, the cholera people walked past our house on their way to the clinic, their eyes cloudy and skin wrinkled from dehydration. I'd watch them until they got close, then run down the trail towards home. But as soon as they passed, the starving people would follow. Between hunger and cholera, we had many funerals in Wimbe. At home, Jeffrey's anemia grew worse. His legs became grotesquely swollen with kwashiorkor. If you touched his foot, your finger left a mark in his bubbled skin, and if the foot were made of clay. Can you feel it? I asked one day, touching the blisters. Does it hurt? I can't feel anything, he said. He also became dizzy and had trouble walking a straight line. One afternoon, I was taking him outside into the sunshine, but he stopped and said, "Wait, come back, I can't see." We stood there until his eyes adjusted to the light before we continued. For months, his mother had only served him pumpkin leaves, and now, like Kamba, my cousin was starving to death. With little else to do, my mother took half of our flour for the day and gave it to Jeffrey's mother. "There's enough here for porridge," she told her. "It isn't much, but I can't watch my own family suffer." We were all losing weight, especially me. The bones were now showing in my chest and shoulders, and the rope belt that I had made for my pants no longer worked. Now I just pinched 2 belt loops together and tied them off with a stick, twisting more and more as I got thinner. My arms and legs looked like blue gum poles and ached all the time. I had trouble squeezing my hand into a fist. One afternoon, I was pulling weeds in the field when my heart started racing so fast I lost my breath and nearly fainted. What's happening with me, I thought. Terrified, I bent down slowly until my knees touched the dirt, then stayed there until my pulse returned to normal and I could breathe again. The same night, I sat in my room with the lantern while the hunger played games with my mind. If I sat still enough, the walls began to spin in slow circles like a merry-go-round. I followed a centipede up the wall for what seemed like hours. Then a mayfly flew close to a lantern. I grabbed it by the wings and asked it, "How are you alive? What are you eating?" One thing was certain, no magic could save us now. Starving was a cruel kind of science. Even my father, once a giant man, shriveled like a raisin. Sharp bones now replaced brawny muscle. His teeth seemed bigger, his hair was thinner, and for once I noticed the scars on his skin. One afternoon he reported having trouble seeing across the courtyard. The hunger was robbing his vision, just like it had Jeffrey's. It seemed the thinner my father became, the more he wanted to weigh himself. He kept a maize scale hanging by the rope near the tool shed, and one morning I watched his routine. He walked out and gripped the hook, then hung there like a sack of grain, staring up at the needle. He made a grunting sound and said, 5 kilos. Mama? As soon as my mother came and looked, but she refused to weigh herself. The children were also forbidden. Like many women during the hunger, she started tying her mpango tight around her waist like a belt. She said it confused her stomach and tricked her heart from beating so fast, helping her to breathe. At night, she resorted to mind games to help us children. "You're losing weight because you're thinking about food," she told us. "Don't you know what causes your body to stress and burn more energy?" My sisters cried. Asia said, "But Mama, I don't want to become swollen." "Then think about positive things," my mother told her. "Do that for me." The one positive thing we could dwell upon was our maize crop. Out in the field, the stalks had grown as high as my father's chest. The first ears had begun to form, revealing traces of red silk on their heads, and the leaves and stalks were fading from deep green to yellow. While men withered and died all around us, our plants were coming up fat and strong. 20 days, I predicted to my father. "I'd say you're right." If I was indeed correct, then we had 20 days until the green maize was ripe enough to eat. What we lovingly called dough. It's equivalent to the American corn on the cob, when the kernels were soft and sweet to pop between your teeth. All day and night I dreamed of dough. By the beginning of March, the maize stalks had reached my father's head. At this stage, the flowers told you everything. Once the red and yellow silk began to dry and turn brown, you could start checking for dough. And I'd go from stalk to stalk, pinching the cob to feel the grain. If the kernels crushed easily under my fingers, it was too early. If they felt firm, then it was time. Every morning for a week, Jeffrey and I walked up and down the rows, pointing out the ones that were nearly done. Then I finally spotted a cob that appeared ripe and gave it a squeeze. It was firm. "This one's ready," I said. "Yeah," said Jeffrey, pointing to another, "and so is this one, and this one, and this one. Our long-awaited day has finally arrived. Let's eat." Using the last of our energy, we ran through the rows, pulling the ripe dough and cradling them in our arms. Soon we had 15 ears, and Jeffrey had the same. We pulled back the first layer of husks and tied them all together and draped the chain across our shoulders. The sight of Jeffrey and me running through the courtyard with necklaces of dough nearly caused a riot. "It's ready?" Asia asked, her eyes wide and excited. "Ready. The dough is ready." In the kitchen, I stoked the coals of my mother's fire until they burned red. Soon my sisters were crowded inside the door, fighting for space. "Relax," I shouted. "There's plenty of dough for everyone." I placed several cobs directly on the coals, then flipped them until the peels were crisp and blackened. I burned my fingers, pulling one off, and then stripped the streaming husks and began to eat. The kernels were meaty and warm and filled with the essence of God. I chewed long and slow. Each time I swallowed, I was returning something that had been missing long ago. Looking up, I saw my parents in the doorway. I don't think think this dough is ready," my father said, snatching one off the fire. He pulled off the silk and took his first bite. Within seconds, the blood of life seemed to rush back into his face. He knew we would live. "It's ready," he said, and smiled. That afternoon, we must have eaten 30 ears of maize. As if heaven opened up, the first pumpkins in our fields were also ready. My mother boiled them, seeds and all, then served up baskets of steaming meat. My God, to have a stomach filled with warm food was one of the greatest pleasures in life. Jeffrey and his mother started coming over and enjoying meals of pumpkin and dough with us. Soon the swelling in Jeffrey's legs went away and he was smiling like his old self. For Jeffrey and me, March was like one big celebration. Each morning before work, we made a fire in the fields and ate a big breakfast of roasted maize and pumpkins. I remember the parable that Jesus told to the disciples, the one about the sower of seeds. The seeds planted along the road get stepped on and damaged. Those planted in the rocky soil can't take root, but the ones planted in the thorns, they get tangled with barbs. But the seeds planted on the fertile soil live and prosper. Mr. Jeffrey, we're like those seeds planted on the fertile soil, not on the roadside, stepped on by everyone walking past. No, not us. That's right, we lived, we survived. Chapter 9, the library. All across the district, the dough and the pumpkins were like a great army marching to save us from certain death. Of course, our lives wouldn't return to normal until the harvest, which was still months away. At night, the same blob of Zima greeted us at supper. But at least it was the start of something better. In the trading center, people began to smile and talk about the future. As the district slowly reclaimed its energy, students at Kachokolo returned to school to resume their studies. But since my parents still couldn't afford my fees, I was forced to stay home. Besides some weeding, there was little work for me to do in the fields until harvest. I spent a lot of time in the trading center playing bawo. Someone also taught me a wonderful game called chess, which I played every day. But these games weren't enough to keep my mind stimulated. I needed a better hobby, something to trick my brain into being happy. Day and night, all I could think about was school. I missed it terribly. Then I remembered that a small library had opened the previous year in Wimbe Primary. It was started by a group called the Malawi Teacher Training Authority, and all the books were donated by the American government. Perhaps reading would keep my brain from getting mushy. The library was housed in a small room in the main office. I entered and was greeted by a nice lady who smiled and said, "Come to borrow some books?" This was Miss Edith Sikello. She taught English and social studies at Wimbe and acted as the school librarian. I nodded, then asked, "How do I do that? It is my first time ever seeing such a thing." Miss Sikello pulled back the curtain to reveal 3 giant shelves that nearly reached the ceiling, each filled with books. The air smelled sweet and musty, an aroma I'd find comforting from that day forward. She explained the rules of borrowing books, then showed me the many titles available. I expected to find primary readers and other Malawian textbooks, but to my surprise, these books came from all over the world. Places like America and England, Zimbabwe and Zambia. I saw books on English, history, and science, even novels for leisurely reading. I spent hours that morning sitting on the floor, flipping through the pages and marveling at the pictures. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to escape without going anywhere. The books from other countries were especially fascinating. Then I ended up checking out the same Malawian textbooks my friends were studying at school. It was the end of the semester and my plan was to get caught up before classes started again. Back at home, I fashioned a hammock with flour sacks and strung it between 2 trees. I spent my mornings at the library, and during the warm afternoons, I read in the shade. Right away, Gilbert offered to help with my independent studies. Each day after school, he stopped by and explained the lessons. What did you cover in science? I'd ask. Weather patterns. Can I get your notes? For sure. But as much as I loved to read, I found it terribly difficult. For one, my English was bad, and sounding out words took a great deal of time and energy. Plus, some of the material was confusing since I didn't have a teacher to explain things. In agriculture, I asked Gilbert, what do they mean by weathering? It's when rain breaks apart the rocks and soil. Ah, got it. One Saturday, Gilbert met me at the library just to look at the books for fun. We couldn't study all the time. The first thing I spotted was the Malawi Junior Integrated Science book, used by the older high school students. Inside were lots of diagrams and photos of strange and interesting things. People with rabies and children stricken with kwashiorkor. Like so many who'd wandered our country. One picture showed a man in a puffy silver suit. What's happening here? I asked. It says he's walking on the moon, Gilbert said. Impossible. Turning the pages, I saw the photo of Nkula Falls on the Shire River, located in southern Malawi. It's where Eskom operated the hydro plant I mentioned earlier and where the country got its electricity. The only information I had was that the river flowed downhill until it reached the plant. Then, poof, there was power. How and why this worked, I had no clue. But this book explained everything. It said the water turned a giant wheel, and the plant called a turbine, and the turbine produced the electricity. Well, I told Gilbert, sounds exactly like the bicycle dynamo. It lights the bulb by also turning a wheel. The photo of Nkula Falls made me think about the dambo behind my house. During the rainy season, there was always a waterfall. What if I put a dynamo beneath it? I said. The falling water could do the spinning and produce electricity. We could listen to the radio whenever we wanted. The only problem would be the running wires all the way to my house, which would cost a fortune. And what would I do the rest of the year when the marsh was just a soggy swamp? I guess I'll have to research this a little more, I said. Later that day, we came across another fascinating book called Explaining Physics. It was also filled with photos and illustrations, mainly from England. To my surprise, it answered many of the questions I'd been asking for a long time, such as how engines burned gasoline in order to move, and how CD players read the music on the shiny discs. For those of you wondering the same, it uses a laser beam. I found an entire section on batteries. Another photo demonstrated how brakes on a car worked. I'd always assumed that cars used strips of rubber to stop the wheels like a bicycle. This book said otherwise. Vacuum brakes, I said. Wow, Gilbert, I really need to borrow this book. But Explaining Physics was way more difficult to read than Integrated Science. The words and phrases were long and complicated and not always easy to translate. After a while, I devised my own system by reading words in context. For example, if I was interested in a photo or illustration labeled figure 10 and I didn't know what it meant, I'd comb through the text until I found where figure 10 was mentioned. Then I'd studied all the words and sentences around it, often asking Miss Sakello to look them up in the dictionary. Can you look up the word voltage? I asked. Sure. Any others? Resistor? Oh, and diode. Slowly, this is how I began to learn English, as well as the sciences that would soon capture my imagination. After a couple of weeks of reading this book, I came across the most amazing chapter, the discussion of magnets. I knew a little about magnets because they're found in radio speakers. I'd busted off a few and taken them to school as toys, moving slivers of metal around through a piece of paper. The book explained how all magnets have north and south poles. The north pole of one magnet will stick to the south pole of another, while identical poles always resist. You've probably experienced this yourself with playing around with these things. In fact, the Earth itself has a liquid iron core that acts as a giant bar magnet in relation to its poles. Magnets, like the Earth, have natural force fields that radiate between the poles. The south end of a bar magnet will always be pulled toward the north pole of the Earth. That's how the compass works. The bar magnet inside always pulls north to keep you from getting lost. The most fascinating section was about electromagnets, which work by applying power to a coil of wire. According to the book, you can make them out of everyday objects such as nails and batteries. When electricity from a power source, such as a battery, passes through the coil of wire, it creates a magnetic field. This magnetic field can be even greater if the wire is wrapped around a good conductor, like a nail. The more it's wrapped, the stronger the electromagnet. The strength can also be increased by using thicker wire or by applying more power. The book showed giant electromagnets picking up cars and heavy pieces of metal, but smaller ones that explained how to power simple motors and things like radios and car alternators. Aha, I said aloud, we're talking about radios. I was sitting in my hammock when I read this piece of information. It had taken me over a month to get this far in the chapter, mainly because all the strange English words to learn. But now I reached the juiciest part. How do these motors work? Well, in the simple electric motor, a coil of wire on a shaft sits inside a casing that's actually a large magnet. I knew this much by taking apart radio motors and unraveling the copper wire, mainly to make toys and stuff. When this coil of wire is connected to a battery or any power source and becomes magnetized, it gets all charged up and wants to fight with the larger magnet surrounding it. The push and pull between their opposite poles causes a shaft to spin. You know the fans that we use in the summer to keep cool? The blades are spinning around and around because this fight is going on inside. During all this fighting and spinning around, these motors produce their own kind of energy called alternating current, or AC. There's a second kind of energy called direct current, or DC, but that's mostly found in batteries. Direct current flows in one direction, from one end of the battery to the other, while AC changes direction and can be used in more ways. It's also easier to transmit. Because of this, most electronics use AC power. The book gave an example of the AC generator motor, a bicycle dynamo. Aha, I said again, remembering back to when Jeffrey and I were playing with the dynamo and trying to power the radio. It didn't work when we'd attached the wires to the battery terminals, which only used direct current. But when we jammed them into the hole that said AC, the radio came to life. The book went on. The movement energy of the dynamo is provided by the rider. Of course, I thought, that's how spinning motion generates power, in a dynamo and in the Eskom turbines on the river. I can't tell you how exciting it was for me. Even if the words and phrases sometimes confused me, the drawings were clear in my mind. It was like seeing an entirely new language composed of symbols, those for AC and DC, positive and negative, batteries and switches in a circuit, and various arrows for showing the direction of current. Right away, I understood this language clearly, as if my brain had known it all along. About a month later, school ended for the semester and Gilbert had more time to hang out. One morning, we went to the library, but as soon as we arrived, Miss Sakello hurried us to leave. You boys spend hours in here taking my time," she said, "but today I have an appointment. Just find something quickly." The reason it always took so long was because the books were in disarray. They weren't shelved alphabetically or by subject, which meant we had to scan every title to find something we liked. That day, as Gilbert and I looked for something good, I remembered an English word that stumped me in one of my other books. "Gilbert, what does the word grapes mean?" He said. "Never heard it before. Let's look it up in the dictionary." The English Chewe dictionaries were kept on the bottom shelf. We'd always use the one on Miss Sakello's desk, but given her mood, I didn't dare ask her for it. I squatted down to grab another dictionary, and when I did, I noticed a book I'd never seen. It was pushed deep into the shelf and slightly hidden. "What's this?" I wondered. Pulling it out, I saw it was a textbook from America called Using Energy, and this book has since changed my life. The cover featured a long row of windmills, though at the time I had no idea what a windmill was. All I saw that were tall white towers with 3 blades spinning like a fan. "Gilbert," I said, calling him over, "don't these look like a pinwheel that you, me, and Jeffrey used to make?" "We used to find old plastic water bottles in the trading center. We'd cut the sides into blades like a fan, drive a nail through the lid, then hang it on a stick. The wind would spin the blades. A kid's toy." "Yeah," he said, "you're right. But these things are giant. What are they for?" Let's find out. Energy is all around you every day, the book said. Sometimes energy needs to be converted into another form before it is useful to us. How can we convert forms of energy? Read on and you'll see. I read on. Imagine that hostile forces have invaded your town and defeat seems certain. If you needed a hero to save the day, it's unlikely you would go to the nearest university and drag a scientist to the battlefront. Yet, according to legend, it is not a general who saved the Greek city of Syracuse when the Roman fleet attacked in 214 BC. It explained how Archimedes used his death ray, which was really a lot of mirrors, to reflect the sun onto the enemy ships until one by one they caught fire and sank. That was an example of how you can use the sun to produce energy. Just like with the sun, windmills could also be used to generate power. People throughout Europe and the Middle East use windmills for pumping water and grinding grain, it said. When many wind machines are grouped together on wind farms, they can generate as much electricity as a power plant. It all snapped together. I turned to Gilbert to see if he was reading the same stuff. "If the wind spins the blades of a windmill," I said, "and the dynamo works by turning the pedals, these two things could work together." I remembered what the book had said about the dynamo. The movement energy is provided by the rider. "Gilbert, the rider is the wind." If I could somehow get the wind to spin the blades on the windmill and rotate the magnets in the dynamo, I could create electricity. And if I attached a wire to the dynamo, I could power anything, especially a light bulb. All I needed was a windmill, and I could have lights. No more smoky lanterns that left us with sore throats and hacking coughs. With a windmill, I could stay awake and read instead of going to bed at 7 with the rest of Malawi. But, most important, a windmill could also pump water. With the most of Malawi still reeling from famine, a water pump could do wonders. At home, we had a small, shallow well that my mom used for cleaning. The only way to get water was by bucket and rope. If I attached a windmill and a pump to that well, I could pipe water into our fields. My God, I thought we could harvest 2 times per year. While the rest of Malawi went hungry during December and January, we'd be picking our second crop of maize. The pump could also allow my mother a year-round garden to grow things like potatoes, mustard greens, and soybeans, both to eat and sell at the market. I began to get excited. No more skipping breakfast, Gilbert. No more dropping out of school. With a windmill, we'd finally release ourselves from the troubles of darkness and hunger. A windmill meant more than just power. It meant freedom. Gilbert, I am going to build a windmill. I'd never tried anything like it before, but I knew that if someone else could build them in Europe and America, then I could build one in Malawi. Gilbert smiled. When do we start? We start today. In my mind, I could picture the windmill I wanted to build. But before I attempted something so big, I wanted to experiment with a smaller model. I'd still need the same materials, blades, a shaft and a rotor, wire, and something like a dynamo or a small motor to generate electricity from the moving blades. Jeffrey and I had used regular sized water bottles for our pinwheels, but now I needed something stronger. Back home, I started looking around and spotted just the thing. It was an empty jar of body care lotion that my sisters used to play cricket. It was plastic and shaped like a tub of margarine with a screw top lid. Perfect. Leaving the lid intact, I removed the bottom with a bow saw, then cut the sides into 4 strips and fanned them out like blades. I poked a hole through the center of the lid and nailed it to a bamboo pole, which I drove into the ground behind the kitchen. Right away, I realized the blades were too short to catch the wind. I needed to make them longer. In our village, we took our baths in a tiny hut made from grass that was open at the top. We typically installed plastic PVC pipe under the floors to keep them from flooding. Not long before my Aunt Chrissy's bathhouse had collapsed in a storm, so they built a new one right beside it. The old one was still there, however, and I knew there must be some pipe buried beneath the rubble. After 20 minutes of digging, I managed to pull it free. I sawed off a long section, then cut it down the middle from top to bottom. Back in my mother's kitchen, I stoked the fire until the coals were red, then held the pipe aloft over the heat. The plastic began to warp and blacken as it melted. Soon it was soft and easy to bend, like wet banana leaves. Before it could cool down and harden, I laid it on the ground and pressed it flat with an iron sheet. Using the saw, I then carved 4 blades, each one measuring 20 centimeters in length. Once again, I didn't have the right kind of tools, so I had to improvise. This time, I needed a drill. Looking around the room, I found a long nail and took it to the kitchen. First, I drove the tip into the maize cob to create a handle, and then placed the nail in the coals. Then it glowed hot. I poked holes in both sets of plastic blades. I used some wire to connect them to the bottle, and then I didn't have any pliers to twist it tight. Instead, I used 2 bicycle spokes. That's when my mother found me. "What are you doing messing up my kitchen?" she said. If there was one thing she hated was the kids messing up her kitchen. "Get those toys out of here." I tried to explain about the windmill and my plan to generate power, but all she saw was the mangled pieces of plastic and a bamboo stick. "Even little children play with more sensible things," she said. "Go help your father in the fields." "But I'm building something." "Something what?" "Something for the future." "I'll tell you something about the future," she said, and scooted me out the door. It was pointless to try and explain. What I needed now was a bicycle dynamo or motor, and I had no idea where I would find one. Of course, I knew I could buy one. A shopkeeper named Dodd had one for sale at his hardware store in the trading center. I'd seen it on the shelf in the months before the famine, wrapped in plastic, so shiny and so out of reach. I went back this time, and sure enough, it was still there. Dodd smiled when I approached, so I tried my charm. Fine day, Mr. Dodd, I said. Yes, fine day. Your family? Oh, fine, fine, thanks for asking. Say, how much for that dynamo behind you? 500. I leaned forward and gave him the sorriest look I could muster. Yes, but you see, Mr. Dodd, I don't have 500. He laughed. You know how it works. Go find the money and come back. It will be here, and if not, I can order another. I could get the money doing Ganyu work, maybe some odd jobs here and there. In fact, I'd heard that guys were making 100 kwacha a day unloading trucks at the dry goods store. If I worked a week, I could make enough money. I headed right over to the store and was the first one there. I'll get hired for sure, I thought. I waited and waited. Morning became afternoon, and the sun grew dreadful, and I'd forgotten my water. Finally, the owner walked out. Why do you keep standing here? He said. I'm waiting for the trucks. They come every day, he said, except Monday. Just my luck. It was Monday. That night at home, I hit up another idea. The bicycle dynamo was the ideal motor for the large windmill I wanted to make, but for the test model, I could get by with a much smaller generator. I knew just where to find it. I walked over to Jeffrey's house and found him in his room. Hey, Bumbo, do you remember where we put that international radio and cassette player? Yeah, it's here someplace. Why? I want to use its motor to generate electricity. Electricity? Yeah, from a windmill. Every time Gilbert and I visited the library, Jeffrey said he was too busy working his fields. To be honest, he didn't seem that interested anyway. We're headed to the library, we'd say. Want to come? Go ahead, he answered. Waste your time. But now, when I told him my idea of building a windmill that could produce power, and then showing him what I built so far, he saw things very differently. Cool, where'd you get such an idea? The library. Jeffrey found the international cassette player under his bed, and I went to work. My screwdriver, in this case, was a bicycle spoke that I'd hammered flat against the stone. Wasn't anything pretty, but it worked to remove the screws from the radio's casing to allow me inside. After a little prying and jiggling, I removed the cassette deck and found the motor. It was half as long as my index finger and shaped like a AAA battery. A short piece of metal stuck out of the top like a stem. Attached was a small copper wheel that spun the magnets inside and gave the radio its energy. Using some wire, I attached the motor to the windmill. My idea was to have the body care lid turn the copper wheel as it was spinning, like two gears in motion. But when I spun the lid, it just slipped against the copper. I needed some friction to make the gears catch. What we need is some rubber, I told Jeffrey. Yeah, where do we get that? I don't know. What about from a pair of shoes? Now you're thinking. The rubber from our flip-flops was too spongy and not durable enough. Otherwise, we'd be set. Everyone in Malawi wore flip-flops. We needed a special kind of rubber, the kind we use to make flats worn by most women in Wimbe. Where the only problem, a company called Shoe Rubber was going through the villages collecting old shoes to recycle and make new ones. They were offering a half kilo of salt for each pair, so of course most women took the deal. I wondered if it was even possible to find used shoes anymore, but it was worth a try. All day, Jeffrey and I dug through the garbage piles all over Masitala and Wimbe looking for these shoes. Finally, after sifting through mounds of peanut shells, banana peels, and old rusty cans, Jeffrey held up a shoe. One shoe. Tonga! The black flat had been buried so long it was now gray and filled with crusty muck. It smelled like goat skin. Good job, chap, I said. Using my knife, I carefully carved an O-shaped piece out of the rubber. small enough to slide over the motor's copper wheel like a cap. It took more than an hour to do, but once I pressed it on, the 2 gears caught just right. The next step was to test the motor to see if it produced current. Jeffrey began spinning the blade by hand, and I took the motor's 2 wires and touched them to my tongue. Feel anything, he asked. Yeah, tickles. Good, then it works. Now the question was, what should we power using this little windmill? I decided it would be Jeffrey's favorite radio, an old Panasonic that he listened to while he worked in the fields. Jeffrey loved his Billy Conda music, and sometimes I'd even sneak up on him in the maize fields and catch him dancing. I held the windmill while Jeffrey popped off the Panasonic battery's cover and removed the cells. Using my knowledge from the books, I assumed that because the radio operated on batteries, its motor produced DC power, which meant we could connect the wires straight from the radio's positive and negative terminals. Jeffrey pushed the wires inside, then twisted them so that they connected to the heads. Now, what do we do now? He asked. Now we wait for the wind to turn the blades. Just as I was saying that, the wind began to blow. My blades started to spin and the wheel began to turn. The radio popped and whistled, and suddenly there was music. It was my favorite group, the Black Missionaries, on Radio 2, singing their great song, We Are Chosen, just like Moses. I jumped so high, I nearly disconnected the wires. You hear that? I screamed. We did it. We actually works. At last, Jeffrey said. Now I'll go even bigger. Superpower. The success of my small windmill gave me confidence to attempt an even bigger machine, and I'd already started to make a list of materials. I would still use PVC pipe for the blades, though I'd need much longer pieces. The blades would have to attach to a rotor, which needed to be some kind of flat metal disc. Plus, I'd need a shaft or axle to make it all spin. The best thing I could think of was the bottom bracket of a bicycle. The bracket, or gov, as we called it, was what attached the bike's pedals to the crank set and turns the chain to spin the back wheel. But in this case, I'd replace the pedals with blades. When the back wheel spun, I'd have a dynamo attached to generate the power. Basically, I was going to hoist a bicycle into the air like a flag to catch the wind. Just trying to imagine it made me laugh. But of course, none of this changed the fact that I still had no money to buy materials. So, like with a smaller machine, I had to go and find them on my own. For the next month, I woke up early and went searching for windmill pieces like I was exploring for treasure. The best place I knew was an old tobacco plantation across from Cochocolo School. The abandoned garage and scrapyard were littered with machine parts and stripped bodies of cars and tractors, all forgotten and left to rest. Gilbert and I used to play around there, but never had much use for the junk. Now I was returning to the yard with a mission. I set out one morning over the hills and streams, noticing how the land hadn't changed much since the end of the rains. The grass was still high and starting to fade to brown, but the maize in the fields was tall and green. Soon we'd be harvesting and our problems would be over, at least for this year. At the school, I turned into the plantation and stopped at the entrance of the scrapyard. Behold, now that I had an actual purpose and a plan, I realized just how much treasure lay before me. Old water pumps, tractor rims, half the size of my body, filters, hoses, old pipes, and plows. Several stripped car bodies lay bleached by the sun, in addition to 2 abandoned tractors. They had no tires or engines, just rusted gear parts in their bellies. Inside the cabs, the glass was busted off the instrument panels, but the steering wheels, clutch, and pedals were all intact. Aside from the sound of the grass swaying in the wind. The scrapyard was silent, and I was beautifully alone. The first afternoon, I discovered a large tractor fan, the perfect design for my rotor. I could bolt the PVC blades directly to the middle blades of the fan. That same day, I found a giant shock absorber, which I banged against an engine block to knock off the casing. Inside was a long piston, the ideal windmill shaft. I needed some kind of ball bearing to connect to the shock absorber and gauge to reduce the friction. In order to find the right size, I used a piece of rope as a measuring tape and went around to all the various shafts with bearings attached. After 3 days, I found the right match on an old peanut grinding machine. I used a rusted coil spring to bang the bearing loose and found it was in pristine condition. The only problem with the scrapyard was that it sat directly across from Coachocolo School, where I left a bit of my heart. The school was currently empty until students returned in a few short weeks. I could see through the windows. For a brief moment, I imagined myself back at my desk. "Look out," I said. Your man Kamkwamba will be there soon." All right, that's the end of chapter 9. And next week we will pick up with chapter 10. So I am going to say good night, sleep tight, and sweet dreams.